here it is.
Kidding. 29th of February.
Wait till everybody gets in. There's probably a crowd.
Fanciest picture I've ever seen.
Well, there were a bunch of people standing out there. Oh, wasn't there? When I was out there a little bit ago, seemed like there were quite a few.
There's another thing going on.
Oh.
Might want to go give them a warning.
Is that you, John?
I thought maybe Andy Allen would be here tonight. I haven't seen him out there.
I think the weather is keeping some people out.
Can we take pictures of you guys? I mean, I've just seen so many.
That would be cool.
Here we go.
We're going to start it up here real quick.
No, I haven't got this side yet.
All right, Kris, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready now.
Okay. Welcome and thank you for coming tonight. We feel this is a very timely and important topic. My name is Kris Scott, and I'll be explaining the rules and the format. Before I'd like to do that, I'd like to introduce people on the panel right now. This is Laura Ebke, head of the Republican Liberty Caucus. Next to her is Tim Butz, former executive director for the ACLU. Next to Mr. Butz is Bryan Baumgart. In the middle, he's the newly elected Douglas County Republican Party chairman. To his left is Kris Pierce, who's a Douglas County Democratic chairman. I have Michael Knebel to his left, and Michael is a part of the Libertarian Party as a communications director. We have Mark Zimmermann, who is part of the Green Party, but his comments tonight will be his own. And then additionally, we have Jim Mason, who is the de facto leader of the Tea Party Patriots of the state of Nebraska. None of the panelists here were given any of the questions in advance. They were just simply told this is about gun rights, gun control, and mental health. I'd like to first thank Creighton University for putting this on and sponsoring this in conjunction with the Nebraska Libertarian Party. I'd also like to recognize the Creighton University Republican College Republicans who were the hosting group for this event. And how we're going to do this is we're going to start with 30-second introductions for each of the panelists where they can talk about themselves or the association that they're involved with. After they begin with the introductions, each question will be given to each panelist and they'll have 1 minute and 30 seconds to respond. After that, everybody will have the opportunity to answer a question. Then they'll have 30 seconds for rebuttal. I'll be the timekeeper right here. And I will hold up a yellow card when there's 15 seconds left, and I will hold up a red card when we're out of time. This will be done for all the comments, the rebuttals, and the intros and the closing pieces. The first question will go to the first panelist, and the first question rebuttal will also go to the first panelist. Second question will go to the second panelist first, and the second rebuttal will also go to the second panelist first. So if you're the first one to answer a question, you're the first one that's going to have an opportunity to rebut it. And then we'll close out at the end of this with a 1-minute closing remarks from each of the panelists. And without further ado, our moderator, Kris Davis.
Thank you very much, and welcome. Good evening. What we're looking forward to tonight is a very spirited debate, and like Kris said, it's a very timely issue and something that continues to be in the news on a regular basis. So we're going to get underway right away, and our very first question goes to panelist number 1, Laura Ebke, and the first question is this. The Second Amendment, as well as the Bill of Rights, was adopted in 1791. In your interpretation, what does the Second Amendment do and also not do to a citizen's rights to bear arms?
Well, I think that what it really does is gives citizens an unqualified right to keep and bear arms. If you go back to history and Paul Revere's ride, they were trying to the British were trying to take the arms away from the American colonists, and it's pretty clear to me that the colonists who wrote the states that wrote the Bill of Rights had in mind that the militia was all who could hold a weapon. If you look at the definition of militia, if you look at some of the things that Patrick Henry Lee and some of those said, it's pretty clear that that's what they had in mind with respect to a militia. So I believe that the Second Amendment gives pretty much unqualified rights. Now, that's from the standpoint of the national government. Certainly, the question of incorporation of the rights by the states is something that's open to interpretation. I'm sure that there will be others that will address that as well.
Now, of course, we wanted to have you go ahead and do that, but also at the same time, Kris wanted me to let everybody, allow them to introduce themselves. So I'll let you go do that, and then we'll continue with the other questions.
Well, as Kris said, my name's Laura Ebke. I represent the Republican Liberty Caucus of Nebraska. Our organization really consists of members and friends who are working within the Republican Party. We want to promote a return to real historic principles of the Republican Party, smaller government, fiscal responsibility, an emphasis on civil liberties, free markets, and so on. In addition to my assorted political activities, I teach college part-time political science classes. I'm a mother of 2 daughters, 1 son. I have 1 son-in-law, 1 husband. And with the exception of 5 years, I've lived in Nebraska all my life.
All right, Laura, thank you. Tim Butz, or Butz, rather, sorry.
I want to make it clear I'm not here on behalf of my former employer, the ACLU. I was invited to participate in this as just, I guess, a citizen. I haven't been with the ACLU for 6 years, and I have no idea what their current position is on the debate that's raging today. I never shot a gun in my life till I was 14 years old. My experiences with guns were primarily in the military. I've owned pistols as a civilian, haven't owned a gun in over 35 years.
And our next panelist, Bryan Baumgart.
Yeah, I'm here as the new chairman of the Douglas County Republican Party. My wife and I worked at Boys Town as family teachers, and I continue to work there now. As far as my views on gun control, I think it's important that we have some common sense solutions, but we have to make sure that they're effective and that they respect our individual right of self-defense.
All right, thanks, Bryan. And our next panelist is Kris Pierce.
But as Kris said, my name is Kris Pierce. I happen to be the chairman of the Douglas County Democratic Party. I also happen to be a concealed carry license permit holder. I have a few guns, a few handguns, which may shock people. I know people I know will be shocked to hear that. But I think it's one of the things I want to make it clear, why sit in a certain position. To represent the Democratic point of view from one person, I think is a bit of a stretch. We span, as I'm sure members of each of these parties represent, span a great swath of political beliefs on every subject, so I wanted to put that out there as a caveat.
All right, thank you, Kris. Next, Mike Knebel.
And as Kris said, my name is Mike Knebel. I'm the communications director for Libertarian Party of Nebraska, as well as a representative from the Libertarian National Committee. And the whole purpose of this was just to show that I think that all of us from different swaths of life, different political parties can sit down and have a decent conversation about this. And just very excited that all of you are here, and just to show you that the Libertarian Party does have pragmatic views, and it's not just the crazies you may hear about on the internet.
All right, Mike. That brings us to our next panelist, Mark Zimmermann.
Well, I've looked, and there's really nothing in our Green National Platform about gun control per se. I'm probably like a lot of folks looking for some reasonable middle ground. And I would say if there's a green approach to this problem, that we need to look at it more holistically, that we can't look for security at either, the end of a gun or regulations, but we need to address a lot of social issues that go with this, like access to education and opportunity.
All right, Mark, and our final panelist, Jim Mason.
My name is Jim Mason. I am the state coordinator for the last 2.5 years for the Tea Party Patriots. We have 52,000 registered members here in Nebraska. The gun Second Amendment issue is something that we just voted recently to take on inside our organization of 15 million. Our local coordinators vote online every week on the issues and things within the movement that we feel are pertinent to take on and meet our mission statement and core values.
All right, panelists, thank you once again for the introductions. Now, you heard again with the first question, and I'll reread that Laura had an opportunity to address, and now this goes up to panelist number 2, to Tim Butz. The Second Amendment, as well as the Bill of Rights, was adopted in 1791. In your interpretation, what does the Second Amendment do, and also not do, to a citizen's right to bear arms?
The Supreme Court's clarified in the case of D.C. versus Heller that the Second Amendment reaches to the individual. It's not a collective right, it's an individual right. And I don't see that ruling changing any time. I think that's precedent and it's going to endure the test of time. But it's not an unqualified right. The court stated in Heller that restrictions on gun ownership or conditions for gun ownership can be done in a constitutional manner. And I think the debate now is what is the limits or what is in society's best interest when it comes to identifying any restrictions that might want to exist on gun ownership. The Constitution has a preamble, and that preamble sets out 6 different areas where this Constitution is supposed to protect society, to govern society. And one of those is promoting the general welfare. So I think the Second Amendment has to be read in light of that broader edict that the Constitution and the laws that the federal government enacts do exactly that. They promote the general welfare.
All right, Bryan, the question to you.
To me, the Second Amendment, like all rights spelled out in the Bill of Rights, it's important to remember that the rights we're born with, they're inalienable rights. They weren't given to us by the government, so the government doesn't have a right to come in and take them away. They didn't give them to us in the first place. And I agree with Laura. When you look at the intent of the Second Amendment, we need to go back and look at the intent of our framers, and it certainly had nothing to do with hunting or anything of that sort. It was to protect us from the tyranny that they fought so hard against, and to guarantee that we didn't succumb to that kind of tyranny again. So, as far as limits on the Second Amendment, I think once you start reaching into infringing on people's right to their own self-defense, which is it's a fundamental civil right, and I think that's where it stops. Our rights end where they infringe on somebody else's, and so I think we need to keep that in mind. Anytime I hear the phrase for the common good, that's always a red flag to me. There's lots of tyranny that's come about because of people giving in and sacrificing liberties for the common good. So that's where I stand on that issue.
Now, panelist number 4, Kris Pierce, same question to you, sir.
Okay, so everyone's just waiting to hear what the Democrats going to say. I'm going to shock you here for a second because, and we'll talk about this a little later, but let's talk about when the Second Amendment was written. And actually, it wasn't even part of the Constitution when the Constitution was written. It was actually inserted later when the Bill of Rights was adopted. But where was our country at that point? We were preparing for war against one of the greatest powers, and we had no way to protect ourselves. So the Second Amendment talks about the need for a militia. And I agree with that. But then it goes on and says no one's right to bear an arms should be infringed. If you take a look at 1792, the 2 militia acts, those 2 acts really enforce the militia part of the Second Amendment. It gives the power to the president and powers to the state to create those militias that it calls for in the Second Amendment. But then we get to my personal rights. We've solved the militia part. We have a National Guard. We have a freestanding army. That's not an issue anymore. So then we start talking about our personal rights. And that's where I believe strongly that there's no place for the government to infringe on that right. But as with all rights, including the right to free speech, there's conditions to it. And I think everyone here would agree that there are conditions, given some of the things that have been going on in our own community, that sometimes conditions and qualifications to bear an arm have to be considered.
All right, Kris. Next to Mike.
To get to what the Second Amendment means, we actually have to go back and look at what was contributing to the creation of the Constitution and the philosophical thoughts that were going into it prior to that. And a lot of the framers were looking at John Locke and natural rights, and the very first law of the natural rights, right of self-defense. Talking about each person owning his or her own life, and no other person has the right to take that life, but a person has a right to defend themselves, aggressively if needs be. The Second Amendment comes along and is very clear. There's no in-between language. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security. It doesn't say so long as a well-regulated militia is necessary. So this clearly means that the right to self-defense is a natural right. It's also reaffirmed within the Constitution. So I think that the federal government, and even feelings outside of this, looking at this logistically, the federal government has no right to come in and say, you have no right, and try and take away firearms, take away anything that you can use for defense, whether or not it's firearm, knife, anything of that nature. Anything could be considered a weapon, and the people are part of the militia. It's not the militia as an organized military force. The militia means the people themselves.
All right, Mike, thanks. Now, panelist number 6, Mark Zimmermann.
Oh, I certainly agree that the Second Amendment allows us to own firearms and that shouldn't be infringed on, but I don't think it's a totally unlimited freedom that we have. I guess the way I approach it is there's certain things already that none of us argue that we should have as private citizens. You know, are we allowed to have surface-to-air missiles or military-grade weapons? No, and nobody's arguing that we are? Oh, well. Okay, I stand corrected on that then. What aren't we allowed to have? Certainly there are some things that we're not allowed to have. So my point being, I think we're talking about what constitutes a reasonable limit. We're not talking about absolutes here, and I think too many people just make this into an absolute that if there's any limit, the whole thing's gone, and I just don't see the issue that way.
All right, now to our last panelist. Jim, in addition to having the 90 seconds, we'll pause at that point, and then there'll be an opportunity for each panelist to individually rebut, and we will go starting with you, Jim, after your statement. So go ahead and address the opening statement. The Second Amendment, as well as the Bill of Rights, was adopted in 1791. In your interpretation, what does the Second Amendment do and also not do to a citizen's rights to bear arms?
Shall I go ahead? Okay, so I'm not an expert on this. I haven't spent any time on it. As we understood it, I understand it just like a lot of the people in the audience. It's a right to defend yourself, to right to own weapons, firearms, and to protect yourself and to also prevent an unfriendly government from taking over your government. That's how we understood it. And I think that's a big concern with what we see happening right now. The legislation being proposed in Missouri today is going to tie up the courts for decades, having the rights to go take the right to be able to come in and ask for your weapons, your firearms, your assault rifles, however way they want to list it. But I think there's been a lot of exaggeration of the facts from those who want to are the visual party of trying to take the weapons away from us. We were getting a little bit upset with the attention being drawn on exaggerated facts or standing on the deaths of these children or these events that have happened. I think that it's kind of unfair. It gets brought back up, dies back down, brought back up, and dies back down.
All right, thank you, panelists, for the first question. And in order to keep things on a consistent basis, we'll go ahead and start with Laura on the rebuttal, since it's been the longest since she's had an opportunity to speak on that. Laura, you have 30 seconds now, and each individual panelist will also have 30 seconds to rebut any of the other comments that some of the panelists have made.
I don't know that I have a lot to rebut, perhaps just a little bit, so I'll just make a few comments. The Heller case, as I understand it, was dealt primarily with federal, with the federal Constitution. So the question of incorporation is still out there with respect to the states. If it were absolute, nationwide, without the incorporation to the states, I think we wouldn't have gun laws like we do in Illinois compared to Nebraska. I agree 100% with Bryan as far as the Bill of Rights being inalienable rights that we were born with. And I guess that's all I get to say.
Tim?
And once again, I go back to what Scalia and the majority wrote in the Heller case, that these are not unfettered rights, that they are subject to some reasonable restrictions, and they specifically talk about the state being able to enact restrictions on felons in possession, concealed carry, things of this nature. The question before us today is, can we find some kind of solution to gun violence that is going to guarantee the right of people to bear arms? My time's up. I'll shut up.
See, they're doing this much better than they do in the candidate debate. They have respect for the man with the flag. I like that. This is great. Bryan, go ahead.
Well, in regard to reasonable regulation, I don't think anybody who is favoring gun rights has an issue with keeping guns out of the hands of criminals or those that mean to do harm with them. That's not the problem, but the solutions that often come up end up infringing on our fundamental right of self-defense and the right to defend our families. And we should be able to defend ourselves with the same weaponry used against us.
All right, Kris?
I don't want a crazy person having a 9mm with a 100-round clip in their hand. It's not about the weapon for me. It's more like, do we need a clip or magazine that holds 100 rounds? And the question is, okay, at what point should that be regulated? Should anyone have access to those kinds of clips? I mean, if we look at, we'll probably look at some of the shootings, you'll see by far most of those have to do with very large capacity clips and magazines.
All right, Mike?
I don't want a crazy person having a lot of things, but I mean, sometimes they're kind of fun to be around. I really don't think. I really think the issue of magazine sizes and clip sizes is kind of a red herring, and hopefully we'll get into that a little bit later. But I don't have much to rebuttal against. Just interesting to know that we can own surface-to-air missiles, and I'm wondering if we'll actually be able to get those on eBay at all.
All right, Mark?
Well, I guess I just want to reiterate what I mentioned earlier, is that I think it's not conducive to finding any solutions to argue this in terms of absolutes. Regardless of what we are currently allowed or not allowed to buy, we need to have a reasonable discussion about what are reasonable limits. And I think we're capable of doing that. I think a lot more people agree on this than what you would tend to think with all the heat that this generates.
And Jim, the final rebuttal is to you.
Go ahead.
Yep. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I was watching as the opening questions were being asked, and I'm the most unprepared person up here, but I seem to have got more people nodding than anybody else up here. Thank you very much. I feel a little more welcome on that. The 100-round clips, the 100-round clips aren't killing anybody. They talk about the AK-17, no, the AK-14, AK-47, I got one. A 30-round clip is what's standard for that weapon, and anything else in it just doesn't look like an AK-47.
All right, so I'll move on to question number 2, and again, we'll start with our first panelist, Laura. This, you can start off, and you'll have 90 seconds, and each individual panelist will have 90 seconds as well.
Number 2.
You want me to start with number 2?
I think that's the...
You want me to do number 2? Then you should have put that number 2 on there instead of putting number 1 there. Slight oversight. And speaking of oversight, I'll fix something right here because I'm not exactly sure, and my NRA guys can help me out, what a clip is, but I do know what a magazine is. And so the legislation being proposed to resolve around 2 items. What's that? Is that what it is? Okay. I thought they were the thing that held your chips shut so you didn't get your... Whatever. But we're splitting hairs on that one. Now, legislation is being proposed revolved around 2 major items. One are high-capacity ammunition magazines, and the other are the quote-unquote assault rifles. Is this type of legislation good? Why or why not? And we will start out with our panelist, number 2.
I think that the assault weapon ban, or the proposed assault weapon ban, is somewhat of a red herring. Let's be honest. Most hunting rifles are semi-automatic. What you're talking about is a difference in style rather than a difference in function between a good hunting rifle and an assault rifle. So why are we arguing about style? Why are we arguing about the fact that one has a bayonet clip? What we need to focus on is how these guns get into the hands of people that want to kill. And, we just had this horrible event out in California where a number of lawmen were killed by someone who clearly had a vendetta and access to numerous weapons. How was he able to evade the safety net? How is he able to get these weapons, and how is he able to use them? I think arguing about magazine capacity and the style of weaponry is really pulling us away from a broader issue, and I think society needs to engage in a discussion of the broader issue and red card.
All right, Bryan, to you, sir.
Yeah. I agree, actually. When we get into discussions about, how many crimes are committed, these violent crimes are committed with, large magazines and ARs and things like that, we hear about them. They're in the news because, it's a big issue. But what we don't hear about is all the lives that are saved by the Second Amendment and the right to own firearms. And sometimes that includes large clips. If you go and do your research on the internet, the stories don't pop up often when they have a good ending, but there's stories you run into in January here. A mom down in Georgia who saved her 2 kids from an invader, ended up having to shoot him 5 times to stop him. Now, people aren't always the best shot, or at whatever the circumstances may be, but try telling her that she doesn't have a right to have a certain amount of clips to defend her family. Like I said, this is a fundamental civil right to protect ourselves and our family, and it's reasonable to discuss some common sense solutions. But when they start infringing on that right to protect yourself, putting limits on how you can protect yourself or your family, that's where we have to draw the line. I mean, who gives you the right to decide that this fundamental civil right is less important than the other ones and has to be in the back of the civil rights bus? So,
Kris.
There should not be an assault weapons ban. Should not be.
Thank you.
This is my opinion. The Second Amendment says you have the right to bear arms, but it doesn't say what arms are legal, what arms are not. If you want to go out and shoot a deer with an AR-15 or a Bushmaster 223, that's your business. And restricting the type of weapon that's out there is not going to stop anything. I think what we need to focus on is making sure the right people have weapons, period. All right? If you are mentally disturbed and you have a long history of mental illness, maybe you shouldn't be having a weapon. Let's talk about those kinds of things. Because, I'm not a hunter, although I'm a gunner. I'm not a hunter, so I don't think it's even the right of the government to tell you what you can or cannot hunt with. Now, if you want a lot of meat left on the deer, you may not want to pump 100 rounds into it, but that's your own business. Again, it's restriction. But I want to go back, and I know I got some hisses on the magazines. And I just brought a picture. That's a 9mm with 100 clip magazine in it. Now, to me, this is my personal thing. If you can't hit something with this many things you shouldn't be shooting, you should go back to the target range for a while. There's responsibilities to owning a gun. For CCW, I had to go to a target range and I had to qualify shooting my weapon.
All right, Kris, thank you. Mike?
First of all, to see if legislation would even be feasible or have any purpose to it, let's just take a look at some of the FBI figures for the last couple of decades. And overall gun murders in 2010, we were at a little over 11,000, which was about 3.59 per every 100,000 citizens, the lowest rate since 1981. Violent crime rate in the U.S. from 1991 to 2010 decreased from 758 per 100,000 to 403 per 100,000. Gun ownership actually increased throughout that time. Now, I don't want to say that the causation here and a correlation between that, but what I think we can see is that gun crime is not an increasing situation in this country. The government's own statistics prove that. But what we can see when we look at the overall gun murders, we see 12% of those is directly related between gang violence, gang members shooting each other. An increasing percentage of that is related to what the government so politely refers to as collateral damage. Whether or not you've got a gun with 10 bullets in it, 7 bullets, or 100 bullets, it doesn't change the fact of who's actually pulling the trigger on this. And from what the statistics prove to us is it's not the law-abiding citizens that are doing this. It's a smaller and smaller number of lawbreakers and gang members.
Mark.
Well, I do find a lot of these definitions of what constitutes an assault rifle versus what's not kind of confusing. I talked to a good friend of mine in preparation for this, and he's a strong gun rights advocate. And he had a hard time telling me, what a military-grade weapon is versus not, or an assault weapon versus not. And I think that's kind of missing the point. I suppose I'd pick up on your point that, a lot of what we should be talking about is the gun violence we see, say, in our own city here. And that's not being committed with assault weapons. I'm not against regulating those or against high-capacity clips. I guess I'd leave that to people who are more knowledgeable about the issue to work out. But I think to just solely focus on that, we're kind of missing the point.
And Jim?
The gentleman one seat over from me here kind of touched on exactly where I think we ought to be. The statistics that are being used out there are not getting the notoriety that they deserve. Gun violence in the United States, like they say, and accidental gun violence, from what I understand, accidental gun violence or gun deaths have dropped steadily since the 1920s, every year since they've been keeping the records on it. But away from that and issues that have been coming up that I see that concern me are the access to ammunition, how they're able to buy it. Certain credit cards are not accepting guns or ammunition being purchased over certain ways over the internet. We're seeing a squeeze starting to develop from the outside in to affect what the weapons are. It is a cause of concern to see this starting to develop. as a way to try to affect all gun owners. That's it.
All right, thank you. And Laura.
Well, it seems to me that one of the problems we have with the possibility of an assault weapons ban is that we can't define what an assault weapon is. That definition seems to be somewhat fluid. My understanding is that when you start talking about an assault weapon, you're really talking about something that is fully automatic, and yet now we're talking about assault-style weapons, that they look mean, they look rough, and so I think that that's something we have to keep in mind. I wouldn't be in favor of any kind of assault weapons ban at this point. I think that several of the folks have already gotten to one very important point. It isn't the weapons that we need to be worried about. It's who's getting the weapons, and I think that we need to make sure not so much that the right people have weapons, but that the wrong people don't have weapons. Of course, that's a slippery slope, and I suppose we'll be talking about that in a little while too.
All right, thanks, Laura. Now we'll start with the 30 seconds. 30 seconds of rebuttal, and we'll start in the same order that we began this question in, and we'll start with you, Tim.
There's a lot of talk about data, and I think before we start talking about data, we ought to be aware of a couple of facts. One, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives is prohibited by Congress from collecting a lot of data that would be needed to conduct a scientifically valid study. The Centers for Disease Control, don't tell me no when I'm speaking, please. If you're going to interrupt me, wait till the end. The Centers for Disease Control is prohibited from doing studies on mental health and gun violence. So if we're going to have data, let's have data from all sources. Let's have all the information, and then we can draw conclusions.
All right, Tim. Bryan, you're up.
Yeah, I agree with Laura. The weapons, the magazine, the ammo, it's not the issue. It's not the issue. When these are in the hands of good law-abiding citizens, they're not causing any problems. In fact, they're deterring crime. They're able to protect their families. The issue is when it gets in the hands of the wrong people. And there's consequences of that kind of enacting laws with good intentions, and they have bad consequences. And one of them would be areas of high crime. Disarming the victims. The people there are the people that need the means to protect themselves the most, and we're leaving them defenseless. So.
Kris?
Since we're doing stats, and I've done some research. And actually, is right. First of all, the number of gun owners is down, but the number of guns are up. So there's more of us. There's less of us, but we own more guns. But the interesting thing, in the last 5 years, the murder rate by firearms is down 15% in the last 5 years, which is a good thing. What's interesting, the FBI did a study, 62 mass killings. That means more than four or more people died in a situation. 62 of them since 1992. Interesting fact. 79% of those that had those guns got them legally.
All right, Kris, thanks. Mike?
I know a previous commenter just had a little comment about stats that we're using in figures, and being a libertarian, I'm sure you can all kind of defer where my opinion is of the federal government on certain things, but I think until we have a better source, maybe we should be using these FBI statistics and some of these other government statistics until we have a better study done. But one thing I wanted to comment was on your need about the 100 rounds. And I just wanted to say, if you look at historically, just in the last 20 years, situations with Hurricane Katrina and the LA riots, I'm pretty sure those people that were defending their own property and businesses felt they needed those weapons.
Mark?
Well, I don't know. It's kind of beyond me that somebody would need that big a capacity to defend themselves, but I think a lot of people, at least most polls that I've seen, don't think this is an unreasonable thing to at least look at the issue of high-capacity clips. I agree the assault-style weapons is a little bit tougher to figure out, but I don't know. I have a harder time with the high-capacity.
All right, thanks, Mark. Jim?
I'm going to expand upon the high-capacity clip. I don't see a problem with it. The one good thing I see out of it, you buy your box ammunition, you put them in the clip, you know where they are. You don't have to have 4 boxes sitting out.
And Laura?
Well, I would just say that, the question is not how much you need in your clip until you're actually being accosted in some way. If you have, 5 people walking into your house who are all armed, I'd much rather have a 30-capacity clip than a 5-capacity. So it's all situational, obviously.
All right, panelists, we're going to move on to question number 3 right now. And the first question will be starting off with panelist number 3, Bryan Baumgart, on this. Now, the third question is this. What, if any, preventative measures can be put in place to curb tragedies such that occurred in places like Sandy Hook?
Well, this goes back to our definition of reasonable regulation without infringing on the fundamental right of self-defense. I mean, how arrogant is it to say, we don't need this or you don't need this, and I have the right to decide for you, what means you have to protect yourself and your family. I would much rather have a gun or enough ammunition and not need it than not have it when I do need it. As far as reasonable regulation, the only regulation that I can support, and I'd imagine the full panel agrees with, is that we need to keep the guns out of the hands of the people that are criminals and the ones that are going to commit crimes with them. The other people aren't causing any problems. They have a right to defend themselves. So whether that be mental health checks, mental screening, mental help for people, better parenting, gun education, safety, gun safety classes, how to lock our guns up better and monitor better, watch our kids better. But these are all issues that, parenting and teaching things like that isn't always a duty of the government either. So I think other than education and helping those with the mental problems that need help, then that's where it ends. We can't have the government involved in deciding who needs mental help, though. That's a slippery slope as well, and a means to infringing on our rights when needed.
Well, thank you, Bryan. Kris.
Okay. My more liberal part of my party is not going to like what I'm about to say, but no law would have undone Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook, he had a Bushmaster .223 caliber assault rifle. He had multiple 30-round high-capacity clips. He was wearing a bulletproof vest. Let's take that out. And he also had 2 Glock 10 millimeters, all owned by his mom. They were his mom's. He stole them from his mom. I think in that situation, there were warning signs prior to this incident that should have been seen dealing with that shooter. But as far as using Sandy Hook, now, God love those kids, and it's a tragedy. But there's not a single law, even if there were laws, nothing could have undone that because of how he got those weapons. I want to reiterate something that I said a little bit ago. 62 cases of a mass shooting, that's 4 people more killed since 1992. 79% of the shooters got those weapons legally, got the ammunition legally. This is my personal, this is not a Democrat point of view, but I don't know how we're going to create laws if we can't enforce laws. Gun amnesty, I'm going to bring that up. I'm not a fan of gun amnesty. Yeah, let's get some guns off, but who's going to turn those guns in? If you've got the gun illegally, are you really going to turn it in? Or is it going to be me who's going to turn in the rifle that I inherited from my grandfather and I don't need it? I call them dust guns. So I think we need to be looking at the real situation and not necessarily the instrument that happened.
Thank you. Mike.
As a parent, what can you do to protect your children at school, at the movie theater, at the shopping mall, outside of being with them 24/7 and padding them up completely? Unfortunately, in this life, there's no 100% guarantee of safety. That's a good thing and that's a bad thing. 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, we had that shooting at Von Mar. We've had shootings at various schools here. What would help those out? Some of it's got to be situational. Maybe some of it, when you're looking at the difference between public and private schools, you got to look at what part of the city or what part of the country you're in. Maybe some private schools having metal detectors. It's up to them to decide because they're a private institution. When you get to public schools, the situation's a lot more complicated because this is a place of learning. And I think that's where the answer really lies. When we're talking about what's protecting our youth, we look at things like sex education, driver's education. We look at trying to expand after-school programs, but not one of these things tackles gun education and gun safety. And I really feel like that is where the answer, part of the answer lies, is if we get education in these classrooms in relation to gun safety and get them around it, we take some of the taboo off of it, and maybe we can help prevent some of these future tragedies.
And Mark?
Well, when we talk about preventative measures, the two things that immediately come to mind, depending on which camp you're in, is either more guns or more regulations. And I want to reiterate what I said in my introduction. I think that's just too brittle of an approach, and that we need to, if you don't want to regulate, then what are you going to do? We need to address things like maybe the widespread misuse of psychiatric drugs, which seems to be a common thread in a lot of these high-profile tragedies that we read about. But even maybe more to the point, in addressing the kind of gun violence we see here in Omaha, I think we need to look at things like access to better education, higher education for folks, a livable wage, give people, some options that don't have them, address poverty, address institutions that strengthen community and make people feel needed and a part of something so that they don't feel isolated and commit these things, or if they don't have a better way to make a living, if they don't turn to dealing drugs and the gunplay that goes with that a lot of times.
All right, Mark, and now to panelist number 7, Jim.
Well, you look at the question that'd be what measures could be done to prevent incidents like Sandy Hook. The only thing that I see that keeps getting left out is there's evil in the world, and evil somehow transfers to these types of incidents and is hardly ever looked at or even brought up. When I look at it, I see it as an act that evil got in there and did it. You can try to, legislate more gun laws or more mental health types of programs, ability to get to where they can identify in advance before something like this happens. But I know we know it's been tried already on what levels. Maybe there's been some success with it. I have no idea. I haven't heard any successes in that way. But I still bring it down to one thing, and that is evil. I'm done.
Laura.
I live in Crete, and I'm on my local school board, and this is a question that we have had to deal with in pretty short order after Sandy Hook. We looked at the questions that whether our security was good or not, and when it gets right down to it, no security in the world is going to stop something like Sandy Hook. We have, they had state-of-the-art security with respect to their locked doors. They had good procedures, but somebody who is that intent on doing damage will probably do it. Maybe one of the things that we ought to be looking at is removing some of our no-gun zones. Schools are definitely no-gun zones, and because of that, I'm not suggesting that teachers ought to be armed. But I am suggesting that when you automatically say that you have a no-gun zone, it tells people who want to do harm that nobody there is going to stop you. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. Same thing at malls, at our theaters, and so on. So I think we need to be careful of what we do. Maybe it's a simple answer rather than more complex answers. We've looked at more resource officers in the schools. The problem is that does cost money, and taxpayers don't want to spend more money either.
And Tim?
What could have prevented Sandy Hook? A gun safe, a trigger lock, something to prevent that kid from using guns that he shouldn't have access to. Responsible gun ownership comes with a price. You've got to make sure that your gun is not going to be used by someone other than you. You may have all the good intentions in the world, all the intentions of home defense, of hunting, of recreational shooting or whatever. But what do you do about that person that breaks into your house, or a family member with mental health problems, as in Sandy Hook, who takes your gun and uses it for a purpose that you find abhorrent? So that's...
All right, now we'll have 30 seconds for rebuttal to the following question as well, and we'll start out with Bryan.
Well, I fully support, gun safety education, teaching people how to use safes and lock their guns up and things like that. But when it comes to Sandy Hook, nothing was going to stop that. We talk about evil, and when somebody wants to make a point like that, they're going to find a way to do it. And so sometimes gun control can have an opposite effect. If somebody like him wants to make sure he commits a crime and he's going to find a way to do it, maybe he'll find a place like a preschool or a retirement community or someplace where he can stand there with a handgun, and he's going to find a way to get it done no matter what.
Thank you, Bryan. Kris?
And this is where I come on board with the capacity of the magazines that we've got available. Now, I'm not saying that they should be outlawed, but maybe there should be a higher criteria. I'm going to give you a case in point. The Tucson. He had an extended clip, extended magazine with 33 rounds. When he tried to reload, that's when they took him down. What if he only had a standard 10? That is the normal standard. Could there have been more people not hurt or killed? I don't know, but he emptied it.
Mike?
I really don't like this whole conversation about the magazine size. I'm glad I'm sitting next to you, though, because I like this kind of back and forth, but it plays no role in it. It plays no role in a person's decision. And when we're talking about safety, what's going to keep our kids safe, what's going to keep us safe in public spaces, is it's going to be a change in how we look at each other from a societal point, and it's going to be a change in our education.
Mark?
Okay, this isn't exactly a rebuttal, but I want to pick up on something that Tim mentioned, and that's about the responsibility aspect of this, and that I think there needs to be sort of a chain of responsibility that perhaps in some ways is even regulation. I don't know if this kid stole the weapons out of a locked cabinet from his mother's, but if she left the guns unlocked, just as an example, and knew that he had these problems, I think that's something that, perhaps ought to rise to the level of a criminal action.
Jim?
I kind of agree with the gentleman immediately on my right said here, Mark, you got to start looking at the value per dollar of the safety factor involved here. I mean, just how much can we afford to spend? Like on the schools. My wife talked just recently about the recent school drills that they just went through. Very interesting how it does it. If they've got an intent to get inside, they're going to do damage one way or another if they've got to get it out of their system somehow.
Laura?
I believe that there is a piece of legislation, and I don't know the number of it right off, but that has, here in Nebraska, that is requiring parents to have a reasonable restriction on gun availability for kids. Certainly, hunter safety is important. When I was in 8th grade, everybody did hunter safety, and I think that something like that is not unreasonable, that it's a good idea for all kids to know what gun safety is about and how important it is.
And Tim, 30 seconds to you.
It doesn't matter how many gun safety classes you have, how many hunter education classes you have. If you allow guns to fall into the hands of people who want to use them for evil, evil will be done. Gun owners have to be responsible with the storage of their guns. They have to be responsible that those guns remain unavailable to those that would cause others harm. And that includes the transfer, the straw man sales, the whole bit.
All right, we move on to question number 4. Thank you. Now, question number 4, we'll start with our panelist, Kris Pierce. And question 4 is this. Is it appropriate for politicians on either side of the political aisle to use tragedies like Sandy Hook or Arizona to call awareness to the gun issue? If so, why or why not?
No. Now, I'll reserve my time for a question I want to ask. I'm a politician. No, they shouldn't, and I think it's just I think it's too lowbrow for who we are and what we're about. I think we should educate but never use it. But I want to come back to, I'm kind of going back and forth on magazines. You're absolutely right. We can't control what someone's going to do. If they're a nutball and they've got a gun and they want to kill somebody, it's going to happen. But they may be able to kill less people if they don't have a 100-round magazine instead of and again, we don't know, and I agree with it. We don't know, but I'm just going to use Tucson as an example because he was ready with more clips to reload his weapon, but when he ran out, they got him.
We're going to continue to keep this to the moderators, please. We'll have an opportunity for that.
And I appreciate that as well. I do. But, look at Columbine. All right? No, but I was going to get to, I'm not going to, I'm trying to transfer off the magazine thing. Columbine, they got those through straw poll. They illegally got those weapons. And they had high-capacity clips. They were going to do what they're going to do. But if there's a way, I think, in my opinion, if there's a way that, you're right, we can't control what people do. If they're going to do it, they're going to do it. But is there a way we control how bad the situation becomes? If you have a 20-round magazine, and that's all they can get, fine. But if they've got 100 and they can get a hold of it easily, one clip, 100 rounds, that's my point.
Again, I guess we should reiterate the question is whether or not politicians on either side of the political aisle should use these tragedies like Sandy Hook to call awareness to the gun issue. If so, why or why not? And we'll continue on now with Mike.
I have a very strong issue against this question by saying either side of the aisle. When you've got a Libertarian sitting up here and a Green Party, there's more than two sides to an issue. Regardless, I do find it annoying when politicians decide to use a tragedy to push their own thing. And quite honestly, that's why I think we all agreed to come here, because it's not one party pushing their agenda. It's all of us sitting down to a table and saying, look, we're not going to try and get somebody elected here, although remember my name in a couple years maybe, I'm just saying. But no, you shouldn't be using tragedies to push your own political agenda. What you should be doing with your own political agenda, so to speak, is trying to step out of the way and make government smaller and more efficient so that people can go about their lives and stop trying to put your own baggage on everybody else.
Mark? Mark, go ahead.
Well, it's kind of a funny worded question. My apologies to whoever made this up. But it's not exactly like they're always using this tragedy to call awareness to it. The awareness is there all of a sudden because it's in the media. People are aware of it, and it'd almost be irresponsible if politicians didn't try and address it when it was, on people's minds. So I guess the problem that I have with it is that it avoids the everyday violence that kind of goes on, like here in Omaha. We see all the, it seems like every week you're reading about a shooting that happens somewhere in town. Somebody gets shot, and that seems to get ignored. And it only kind of comes up as an issue that we talk about when something big like this happens. So to say that they're using it Well, got to talk about it when people are going to talk about it, I guess.
Jim?
Well, this is a good question. We have weekly guidance webinars or online sessions with about anywhere from 500 to probably 1,500 people on the calls. And what we learned was with our sources inside D.C. that is Obama and Biden were using the gun issue, the gun violence issue, to help take away attention from that which was what he was most concerned with, the sequester, the fiscal cliff, the debt ceiling. Well, Benghazi, they're using Benghazi now. So before the election was when we needed attention on Benghazi. But they wanted that attention on the guns and away from, at that time, was the fiscal cliff issues, the sequester, as I said. We had 7 legislative days to be able to try to press some issues that we were trying to get done in there. We explained that to the membership. When we took a vote amongst our members, we still had a 70-some% still wanting to address the guns violence issue. So on this question, I think it's a very good question, is expose that Obama and Biden were using this issue to be out in the forefront to work their the problems they've got on that they're most concerned with right now.
All right, Laura.
Well, I would say that our 24-hour news cycle certainly contributes to all of this because they have time to fill, and so it encourages people to exploit tragedies like this. I think that it's inappropriate for any political party, anybody on any side of the aisle, to exploit tragedies for their own political gain, and that doesn't, to me it doesn't matter whether we're talking about gun violence or about hurricanes or about superstorms or anything else. What I would say is that, we've seen a lot of this exploitation of tragedy lately, and even beyond Sandy Hook. If you watched the State of the Union address the other night, you noticed that the parents of the young girl who had sung at the inauguration and then was killed a few days later in Chicago, that they were there. That is an exploitation of sorts. Not just President Obama. Presidents of both political parties have done that over time, and it's unfortunate when it happens, exploiting personal tragedy for the sake of a political agenda.
Tim.
Am I on my 92nd or 32nd round?
You're on your 92nd.
92nd, okay. Exploiting situations like this is as American as apple pie. It's been happening since the first days of the country, and it's not going to stop tomorrow. What we have to do is start defining the debate a little bit better, defining the discussion. I don't even think we should begin debating until we know what it is we're talking about. We can learn from things like Sandy Hook, and we can learn things and then discuss them. We don't have to start yelling at one another from hour one of day one after something has happened. Is it wrong to exploit? Of course it is. But it's going to happen, and we're going to have to learn how to deal with it and how to change that dynamic from one of exploitation and finger-pointing and blame-naming and into a rational discussion of what it is that we can learn and how we're going to prevent things like this from happening in the future.
All right, Bryan.
Is exploiting or politicizing issues like Sandy Hook okay? No, absolutely not. But using the opportunity to bring up discussions like this, productive discussions, yeah, that's completely okay. But no, when we exploit issues like this and use it as a way to push our agenda, even through executive orders, circumventing Congress, the Constitution to use executive orders, no, that's just exploiting the situation. I wanted to address real quick Kris's comments about the magazine size and the Tucson issue. And I think you've spoke about it here that the issue is keeping these clips or these magazines and guns out of the hands of the wrong people. So any kind of law banning the size of magazines wouldn't have prevented the incident in Tucson anyway, or Sandy Hook. These people want to commit these crimes, they're going to find a way to do it. We want to get the weapons to do it, they're going to find a way to do it. It's just going to serve to keep the guns and magazines out of the hands of people that want to protect themselves and their family. And, you know, that Tucson incident in particular, you know, maybe having somebody in the crowd who was armed would have been able to stop him before he had to, you know, instead of having to wait until he reloaded. The other thing, I mean, that goes back to deterring crime. The fact that we don't know who's armed or unarmed makes everybody safer. I don't have to own a gun and I'm still safer because nobody knows whether I do or not. Would you want to keep a sign in your front yard?
Your time is up. It's time for the 30 seconds of rebuttal, and Kris, we'll start with you.
A couple quick things. There was sheriff deputies at the Tucson event, so there were guns. But I'm going to go back to the original question. What disgusts me is that we're so wrapped up about Sandy Hook. What about the other 386 shootings at schools since 1992? Where's the uproar about all those? So to me, it's about, if we're going to have an uproar, those kids are no more valuable than the kids that got shot in, 2003, 2007, 2010. They're still kids and they still got shot. So if we're gonna make a deal of it, let's make a deal out of every single school shooting.
Mike?
I'm going to kind of take it one step further. How many homicides were there in Omaha last year? A little over 40. When you're talking about exploitation of a topic, presidents down to mayors do this, and it's only exploitation when both sides of the issue aren't covered. Look at how North Omaha shootings are covered in comparison to the Millard shooting. Which one's worse? Neither of them. So why are we covering these things differently?
We'll have a chance to get to that. Mark?
Not exactly sure what constitutes exploiting versus debating, but I kind of tend to think that the media exploit worse than any of the politicians do, for one. And also that if these tragedies should be used for anything, maybe it should be as a call to upgrade enforcements of the laws that we do have on the books. And I mean, that's something we all ought to be able to agree on at a minimum.
Jim?
Well, I'm getting hardly even stomach watching the morning network news programs anymore. When you say using those issues, those tragedies, it's the way that the media does such insulting slurs to make the gun owner look so bad. It's not about the gun so much. It's about the people who like guns or own guns is what they want to try to make it. So they use these issues to try to do such insulting slurs at it. It's just,
Laura?
Well, I would just say again, it's the 24-hour news cycle that perhaps we need to be concerned about, that it encourages overuse, exploitation, whatever you want to call it, because they have time to fill. They have something, they want to get viewers, and so they're covering all of these things. And perhaps some of these things are overblown, not in terms of personal tragedy, but in terms of the impact nationwide.
Tim?
I agree that the news media plays into this, but I want to go back to something said down the table. It's not wrong to call people out who kill people with murder weapons. They deserve the condemnation of society. They deserve more than condemnation in society. They deserve punishment by society. And what the media calls them is nothing compared to what they truly deserve.
that's not what I was referring to.
Bryan?
Well, Kris brought up a good point, all the other school shootings, and we also have all the other homicides that don't get reported because it's not as shocking. So it's easy to jump on an issue that's shocking and make it a political issue and exploit it, and it's no surprise that that happens. Should we do that? No, we absolutely shouldn't. Real quick to get back to deterring crime, the New York papers that printed the names of the gun owners in those 2 counties, I'd be more ticked off if I was a non-gun owner. I'd probably consider suing because all of a sudden my safety is in jeopardy.
All right, we're going to move on to question number 5 right now. And one of the things that have been brought up quite a bit tonight is the mental illness factor. In fact, on not only in this panel, but in the gun control rights and debates all across the country. What level does mental illness have a place in the conversation? And in your opinion, what could be done to prevent shooters, like took place in Sandy Hook, in California or in Arizona, to prevent those types of individuals to have access to firearms? And we're going to start off. We're going to start off now with panel number 5, Mike.
This is where having friends and family in the medical profession kind of helps out. If I was to tell you that 22% of this particular demographic is on some form of antidepressant, what would you think? Would you suspect it was a teenagers? Would you suspect it was males? It's actually the 40 to 59-year-old female group that has the highest usage of antidepressants. The lowest usage of antidepressants actually at just a little over 3.7%. Using CDC statistics, so sorry, more government statistics, but is actually the 12 to 17-year-old males. Mental health does have a serious role in this. What we have here is actually a double-edged sword of the stigma over the last 30 years of depression and mental illness waning, but at the same time we've got doctors that are much freer with the prescriptions of medications. So when you're looking at who is, say, mentally stable to own a firearm, I think we kind of get muddied up in the definitions because who is mentally stable is just muddied up by by society now. I mean, it's when we've got so many different medications that are being prescribed, and oh man, I just totally lost it right there. You ever have that happen? Now, when you just have so many medications that are being prescribed and so many different mental illnesses that are supposedly being discovered, I mean, you've got a situation in which somebody could be considered mentally ill when really all they are is just supposedly hyperactive.
Mark?
Well, obviously this has a place in the discussion, but as far as what the solutions are, I don't know. I think it's a little out of my realm of knowledge. I don't know if there's if this pertains to background checks. I assume this pertains to background checks, and I would certainly say that that's another argument for universal background checks on this. I don't know why people have a hard time with this whole idea of the universal registration and background checks. I mean, we already have it with our vehicles. You know, does anybody consider that intrusive? You know, I mean, well, maybe some of you do, but I mean, really, come on. So I guess that's sort of how I tend to think about it, is that, yeah, we need to include this, and that's probably part of it.
Jim?
Well, that's a tough one. As far as being able to identify an expert or professional, being able to identify who is qualified to be able to own a firearm, or better yet, who is a danger to be around one. I think we're getting into another touchy area of who is, the rights of privacy. I think that's kind of a minefield area there. I really don't feel qualified to even touch this one.
Laura?
Well, I think it's true that the question of mental illness is kind of a double-edged sword. If you start talking about wanting to keep things out of the hands of those who are mentally ill, how do you define mental illness? That becomes the first question. Is it anybody who takes medication for ADHD, or has ever taken an antidepressant, or is currently taking an antidepressant? How does that get reported? How does that fall into the background checks? Is every pharmacist required to report all of those who have refilled a prescription of Adderall in the last month? You run into some real problems there, and certainly HIPAA-type problems, medical privacy problems, if you're asking a physician to report somebody that they don't have reason to necessarily believe that they're dangerous, but that they have some sort of mental illness. So I think that we obviously don't have a good answer to this one. We don't want people who are mentally ill and dangerous having weapons or being in the position of cracking, so to speak, on all of us. But by the same token, there's lots of mental illness out there, lots of types of mental illness, and many of it is perfectly treatable and not subject to these moments. So I don't have the answer.
Tim.
Mental illness can't be the whipping boy on this issue. For decades, we've seen cutbacks in mental health services. And we're going to continue to see those cut back as government grows smaller. And government is going to grow smaller. Yeah, it is. And mental health is not going to be funded to the degree that society needs in order for everyone to have access to mental health treatment. Practitioners will tell you that it's difficult for them to even examine someone and make any kind of predictive estimate of whether or not they have the potential for being violent. So mental health plays into this. Increased mental health funding, if that comes out as part of the solution for that, I'd be all for it. But I wouldn't look at that as being the cure-all and be-all of the problem. The true problem, or the true solution, I think, lies in taking away stigma from mental illness, society becoming more accepting of people with mental illness and truly understanding what it is, and knowing the difference between people that have manageable, controllable mental illness and shouldn't be punished by restrictions on their liberty, and those that are truly beyond the point of being saved by the health system and cannot be trusted with a weapon at any point.
Bryan.
Well, first of all, the government doesn't provide or administer mental health, okay? And I'm not an expert here on deciding who is qualified to decide who's mentally stable or not, but I can speak to who's not or who shouldn't be, and that's the government. State-controlled psychiatry is a terrifying weapon, and if we start allowing the government to decide who's qualified mentally to own, guns or weapons, then we're taking this fundamental civil right and we're moving it from a right to a privilege. That we have to have a privilege from the government, and that's scary. You look at how state psychiatry has been used against people in the past. The Soviet Union used it in the 70s and 80s. It's worst case scenario, but it's likely. And I wanted to point out a couple things that are highly likely. It's a roundabout way to enact gun control and ignore the Constitution. It's a federal database of highly personal information of people who haven't even committed a crime yet. Further erosion of medical privacy. People are afraid to seek. One of the biggest problems is people will be afraid to seek mental help because they'll lose this fundamental right to protect themselves. We're combining criminal and medical systems, and it presents an opportunity for a de facto ban on gun ownership by the government.
Your time's up. Thanks. Kris.
Thanks, Bryan. I got to follow that one. Mental illness, I think this has to be part of the discussion. I think if anyone says this should not be part of the discussion, isn't with their own faculties, because I think there'd be an issue. And I forgot a sheet what I wanted to bring, but anybody that has been deemed by the court as mentally ill and unstable and unfit shouldn't be able to own a weapon. And unfortunately, that was the case at Virginia Tech. He was deemed by the court to be mentally ill and mentally incapacitated, but yet still bought weapons and used them at Virginia Tech. So, I mean, if you get that, then yes. And what I wanted to bring, Indiana University actually did a study on some of the shootings that we've had since, I believe, 1998. And they came up with a list of 12 common, I don't want to say diagnosis, but common threads between all those that deal with mental illness. And I apologize, I don't have them. But there's got to be some responsibility, not only of those gun owners, but of ourselves. If we know someone that isn't quite right, that makes threats, that just goes around the neighborhood and just shoots off in the air, we should be asking ourselves, should that person have a weapon? Because mental illness, you can't control somebody. You don't know what they're thinking. Should that person be released? I mean, that's why we have mental institutions, because people are a danger to themselves and to others. Should we have those people have guns in their hands? So we have to ask ourselves how to do that. Hopefully that won't be asked tonight because I don't have an answer.
All right, now we'll have 30 seconds for rebuttal, and we're going to start off with panelist number 5, Mike.
5 years ago, I had a small bout with anxiety and depression and took Zoloft. HIPAA regulations would have prevented any of you from finding that out. But according to some of the regulations that Obama was proposing, the guy down at Cabela's, if I wanted to go down and buy a handgun to protect my house and my family, would have access to information letting him know that at some point I was diagnosed with some sort of mental illness and prescription medication. And while antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicines act entirely different, the one thing that a private citizen who has absolutely no relation to me should not have access to medical records. I'm getting the red card.
Yeah, we're up against time.
Go ahead. I'm giving you mine.
Mark?
Mark, you can go ahead.
Well, even if we consider these as, I know they're not separate issues, but even if we consider them as somewhat separate, the more resources and help we can give to the mentally ill, it seems like it's going to have a beneficial effect in this area of society as well. And so I think it kind of behooves us to do that, and hopefully that'll help, even if we don't, look at that direct nexus between them.
Jim?
As I said, this one here is a little bit difficult. Tying this in with mental health, anything that could prevent it, my concerns were how it affects how the anti-gun people would try to use it in the Constitution and affect the Constitution. That's where I think our focus should be right now.
Laura?
Well, I think we get back to the problem of who is mentally ill, and we can look through this audience, and I suspect that there are a number of people who either are or have been at some point on some sort of anti-psychiatric or psychiatric type of medication. And so I think it's important that, we need to get people the help that they need, but defining who is truly mentally ill and shouldn't have a weapon and shouldn't have access to weapons is a much more complex problem that I don't know that any of us are smart enough to figure that one out.
Tim?
Yeah, right now the government is the biggest provider of mental health services, and it's through the prison system. And that's a sad fact of life. Those services should be available before people reach the point where they're in prison. The role of mental health in the elimination of gun violence is an important one, but it can't be the only question on the table for discussion. Mental health screening alone is not going to solve the problems that led to mass murders or whatever you want to call them in this country. It's not going to solve the problem.
It's time. Bryan?
Yeah, I just want to go back to unintended consequences again. We're talking about, people that need our help the most, mental help the most, soldiers that come back with PTSD, rape victims, people like that. They're going to be, we could make them afraid to go seek the help they need so they don't commit these crimes if they know their privacy is going to be violated and they're going to lose some of their fundamental civil rights. So,
Kris.
Seriously? Unfortunately, in a lot of these cases, hindsight's 20/20. If you look at Von Maur, there was mental illness signs. If you look at Tucson, if you look at Columbine, unfortunately, we see those hindsight. So how do we get in front of that? And I think that's really the question, is how do we get there before they get there? And I agree with Laura. It's not something simple, and I don't want to even think about trying to figure out that solution. But there is facts. It is there. But what do we do? That's the important thing.
We're up against our sixth and final question, and following the rebuttal portion of this, each individual panelist up here will have some closing remarks and a minute to do that. Question number 6, and we will start out with panelist number 6, Mark Zimmermann. And this is a two-part question, and it kind of dovetails back to what we were talking about earlier tonight. The politicians and the media seem to be emboldened for gun reform and reporting on the tragedies as far as our 24-hour news cycle is concerned, but they seem to focus on middle-class suburbia and yet not notice that gun violence occurs regularly in some neighborhoods, like what takes place in Chicago or Omaha on a regular basis. First part, are our resources being focused in the right areas and right issues? And part B would be, in your opinion, what are sensible solutions to curb some of this existing violence? And Mark, we'll start with you, 90 seconds.
Well, I guess this is what I started out with in my introduction, that these high-profile cases tend to dominate the attention of most folks, and certainly the media. And a lot of the crimes that we see around us in our immediate area, while they get reported here, they don't contribute to the national discussion. And as far as resources, this is a huge problem with very deep roots, and I think it's going to take a long time and a lot of sustained effort to work on this. I think we need to make more resources available to people that don't have them in terms of access to higher education, or at least making it more affordable so that people can go out and get decent jobs, earn a decent living. I think we need to have more livable wages in this country than what we have, so that people aren't driven to crime. I realize a lot of crimes are not gun crimes are not always about money. A lot of them are driven by passion and just anger of the moment. I don't know if I have a answer for those. I think we're always going to have some of that, but I certainly think we can do a lot more with making people less desperate, I guess, giving them hope, making them feel a part of something.
Jim.
Well, yeah, the politicians of the liberal side are the ones that always want to seem to be emboldened into stepping up and taking this issue of guns and gun crime and tragedies and focus it on trying to exploit getting guns out of the hands of the American people. They want to take away. They want to take it away. It's not politically correct to say like what I'm saying, but they want to, as Mark just mentioned, try to move it into the middle class of suburbia and focus that as where this is all happening from. Gun crime has, as I understood it, was not affected by poverty from the depressions from the 1930s. It's, from what we can understand, it's not politically correct to mention culture. There's certain demographics that are involved, but they are not qualified to be allowed to be broadcast. We have to use FBI statistics and face up to the hard facts. The media is complicit with the left, and we know it. And there's no way that we are going to be able to do much to change public opinion on those who are not really involved, if that is Jim, where their sources are coming from.
Laura.
Well, as a parent of a 9-year-old boy, I struggle with some of these issues all the time because, the culture is inherently violent at some level. We talked about this in one of my classes the other day about how much more violent movies are today and how much more kids see today at an early age. Resources of government, I'm not sure that resources of government will solve this problem. Certainly, things like mentoring programs, after-school programs, mental health efforts in school can help some, but ultimately, I think it's something of a crisis of the soul. We have to, fix what's going on in our culture, and part of that is our popular entertainment. Part of it is, part of it can probably be found in our churches and synagogues and so forth. Part of it can be found in two-parent households. If you look at one of the common denominators with a lot of these shooters, you find that they grew up in households or had parents that had one of their parents had been absent for a significant amount of time. And then, television, I don't watch it, so I don't know what's on, but I understand that there are some things that probably aren't very good for kids.
Tim?
To be honest with you, I've lost track of the question, so
I'll be happy to reread it for you.
Oh, resources and solutions. Look, the left has to give up its idea that you can ban assault weapons and it's going to change the world overnight. That's just baloney, and the left has to, at some point, accept it. Conversely, the right has to give up its fear that any kind of change is going to lead to someone knocking on their door and taking away their gun. There's a middle road here, and we have to fashion it. We have to find it. We have to find out what those things are that we can all agree on. What in God's name does anybody need with armor-piercing bullets? What does anybody need?
Please.
You know what? Fine. If you want to talk, here's the microphone, lady.
No, but please keep the comments to that. Let the panelists address in the timely fashion that they're doing. They have 90 seconds to address the point, and there'll be time for that. So we'll get back on point here. If you'd like, Tim, would you like to continue?
If I can continue without being interrupted again.
You should be afforded that.
I think we have to find some common ground and begin working on those issues where we can agree. And reaching agreement isn't going to be easy. You got to give a little to get a little. That's the nature of American politics. Politics is the art, is the art of compromise. And we cannot solve pressing national problems unless everyone is willing to sit down and engage in good faith discussions, admit when they're wrong, concede to the other side when the other side's right, but still adhere to their principles and come up with some kind of workable solution that's going to make us safer. I don't want to take away anybody's gun. My sister lives in a rural area, keeps a loaded pistol by her bedside because the sheriff is 20 minutes away at a minimum in the middle of the night. Do I want my sister hurt? Hell no. And I don't want anybody else's sister hurt either. But, there has to be compromise on this from both sides, and if both sides cling to absolutist positions, we're never going to reach any kind of resolution to this growing, escalating problem of violence.
Tim. Now, Bryan.
We're all for compromise, but that compromise, you speak of absolutes, it has to fall within, here's an absolute for you, the Constitution. It has to fall within the confines of the Constitution. If we can, everybody up here wants to keep, these guns out of the hands of those that mean to do harm. But we have to be able to do that without infringing on the fundamental civil right of self-defense. And as long as we can do that, then, yeah, sure, we'll have compromise. We talk about resources being used in the wrong direction, and absolutely right now, the gun control is using our resources in the wrong direction. Everybody up here wants to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, but passing gun laws have not done that. They can't do that because criminals don't follow laws. Otherwise, we just pass a law to ban murder. What it has accomplished, a couple things. Victim disarmament. It's disarmed our victims, particularly in the areas that people need it the most, where there's high areas of gun violence. Those are the same areas that have a lot of illegal gun ownership, and those people need to protect themselves, and we're telling them you don't have a right to protect yourself when you need it the most. It emboldens criminal activity because it's not deterring crime when you know that you're in a gun-free zone or somebody doesn't have a means to protect themselves, at least the same means you have, then you're going to be emboldened to commit that crime. It's in a way, it's indirect racism. When you look at areas like Omaha, it's North Omaha has the most illegal gun ownership and gun violence, and that's an area that they need
Bryan,
those
time.
guns to protect themselves.
Chris?
We need the question again.
Yeah. Again, I'm happy to repeat it. It's a two-part question. Again, our politicians in the media, we've been talking about this evening, continue to talk about gun reform when tragedy occurs, but mostly when it affects white class, suburban, middle class areas, and they don't seem to pay attention to violence in other areas like cities like Chicago or Omaha, areas that have taken place. Are we focusing our issues and our resources in the right area? And part B, what are some sensible solutions to help curb this gun violence?
Okay, the reason why politicians do that is because politicians will listen to those that will speak up and those that give political contributions. Let's lay it out there. Let's lay it out there. That's true. When you have the unsung, unheard victims of violent crime, it goes to the, out of sight, out of mind mentality, and that's just facts. So it's, I think, part of the responsibility is we as a community, those that live in the community that have high violence, to make that known, to do whatever it takes to get into the face of politicians, of government officials, to say, hey, we've got a problem, do something. If they don't do that, then what they will do is they will go to the white suburban areas that vote, that give money, that are active in their community, because that's who they're going to hear from. That's why I said, I kind of find it a bit insulting when the media and some politicians are all about Sandy Hook, when in the last 20 years, we've had 386 other mass murders in schools. That's when 4 or more people die. But we don't hear about all those. We hear, if we think about the gun shootings we know about, Columbine, Tucson, Virginia Tech, Von Maur because it's local, but it did make national news. 5, 6, okay, I'll give you 10 out of 387. That's a tragedy.
Mike.
It's not the violent movies, it's not the video games, it's not the form of entertainment, it's not the magazine size. These are all just simply reflections of what's going on in society. Where the real issue lies here, and I think we've been kind of tiptoeing around it, is quite simply the fact of how we view each other's life. It's from the drone strikes, which certain people in certain parties are saying are okay because we've classified these people as terrorists without due process. It's from the people in certain other factions that are beating up homosexuals and people of other races because they're different than them. It's from the sections of people that are saying, you know what, it's okay to kill a child as long as it's 8 months but still in the womb. It's when we start putting definitions on whose life is more important than the others. That is where the main issue is lying. It's not about the types of tools or the types of entertainment. It's about when we look out in the crowd and we say, you're better than that person, or I'm better than you, my life's more important. The fact of the matter is the Constitution says we're all equal under the law, no matter if you're black, white, gay, male, or female, and we've got to start living that way.
Now we'll have an opportunity for 30 seconds to a rebuttal, and we'll start off with who started off this question. Panelist number 6, Mark.
Well, I'd like to, I guess, respectfully rebut the fact that, or the statement you made that poverty doesn't play a role in this. I think poverty plays a huge role in this. A lot of these crimes, at least here in Omaha, you're right, they do happen more predominantly in North Omaha, but I think it's a big mistake to mistake race for poverty. I think this is more about poverty, not about race. And also, not everybody on the left wants to take your guns away. I certainly don't.
I don't think I was trying to, if that came off as race, I'm sorry I did. I don't think I said that correctly then.
Okay.
I was talking about poverty statistically back in the poverty back in the Depression era was, we had plenty of guns then. It just didn't show to be a factor then. I think there's a culture of violence, and that is a concern. And I don't think that jobs are technically, jobs and economy right now are the most important issues facing this country.
Time. Laura?
Not really sure what question I'm rebutting at this point. But I do think that it's important for us to remember that that the problem is very complex, and that the resources, if we really want resources, we have to think about what the focus and what the purpose of those resources are. It's easy to throw money at problems and not get a solution. So we got to decide what resources we really need and whether they'll really make a difference.
Tim?
Race is always a factor in every political issue. We have a nasty history that is going to make that a burden on our society for generations to come. There was nothing like the sight of armed Black Panthers walking through the halls of the California legislature to make Ronald Reagan into a firm proponent of gun control measures. And I think that the idea that race is not a factor in this discussion is one we've sidestepped tonight, probably should have spent more time talking about.
All right, with time. Bryan?
Poverty isn't exclusively racial. We need to direct our resources towards providing opportunity and addressing issues. It is a cultural issue. I've had the opportunity to work at Boys Town, and I've worked with kids and families of all different races, and they all have, they struggle with the same things. It's a culture of violence. A lot of them come from gangs and gang areas, and it takes a lot of work to try and change that culture, and that's where our resources could be directed as opposed to infringing on the fundamental civil right of law-abiding citizens.
Kris?
The one thing I want to mention, because kind of as it came to me, we started talking about compromise, and I'm willing to compromise. I will let any weapon be legal if you'll give me a little room on those magazines. I would not hesitate. I don't care what, you can own a bazooka, but just let's control the size of the RPG goes in. The other thing I'd wanted to say, though, is that this is not a singular issue. This has got so many facets, but I think you're right when you said we can't be, or maybe Tim was, we can't be at either sides. We got to find compromise. So I'll support every single weapon that's out there. But remember, one thing that we never talk about, the Second Amendment says you have the right to bear arms. And I know this is a little corny, but it doesn't say the right to bear any of the bullets.
Time.
Ooh, that was perfect time.
Mike, rather.
I know. I had to throw that in there.
I think if we're going to just talk about the legislation about you can have any type of gun you want, but we're going to limit the size of the magazine, I like rebutting yours. I think you have the right to buy whatever type of car you need, but we're going to limit the size of the engine. I mean, I see it as a ridiculous part, but
do that now, actually.
I know. but I would love compromise, because let's face it, we all came here for a common goal, and we all know that there's a serious issue. So I'm willing to work on certain things as long as it doesn't infringe on our own personal liberties.
All right, panelists, thank you very much. Now we'll have 1 minute for the closing remarks, and we're going to start in reverse order. This time we'll start down at number 7 with Jim Mason.
Well, first off, Kris, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor to be here at this esteemed panel tonight. I see the issue here of gun control, and all the talk is, and the attention being on the gun control issues right now is actually a threat. I do not think it's going to go away as fast as we've seen in the past. It comes on and it goes out, comes on and it goes out. This time I think it's going to stay a little bit longer. I see some ridiculous things coming through like I mentioned earlier, like what happened in Missouri today, it's just going to tie up the court for decades. It's not going to really achieve what needs to be done on this issue. And these side issues of getting into being able to purchase the weapons, the government is purchasing ammunition that is illegal for armies to use, but yet they are able to use it. Why are they buying this ammunition? It causes me great concern. The Russian English version of Pravda said, the last thing that Americans must not do is do what we did. They used to be a proud country where they wore their guns on them and their ammunition belts, and they took them away from them, and look what happened to them.
Time.
It was a warning
Thank you.
to us.
Mark Zimmermann.
Well, I guess one of the things that surprised me tonight on this panel is that there are probably a lot of more areas that we agree on than I thought. I mean, certainly not all of them. There's certainly still some major disagreements that we'll have to discuss and work out one way or another. But I was surprised to hear that we do have a lot more in common. And I guess to sum up my approach to it is, again, I'd have to go back and say that not just guns and not just regulations are the answer. Both of those might be part of the answer, but really we need to look at more cultural and social things like giving people more opportunities, addressing mental illness, considering, the levels of violence in our entertainment, things like that. It's going to take a while, and it's going to take a lot of approaches.
Mike.
Even in a purely libertarian world, I don't think we'd be rid of all gun violence. But I think this issue would be a lot smaller. And I really think that if each of you guys and gals go home and just kind of consider this, you're all a little bit libertarian at some point, be it on the fiscal positions, be it on the social positions.
How dare you?
Maybe not him. We're a big umbrella party. We're a growing party. We're the growing voice of the middle class, of the independents, and of the Americans. So I really feel that this has been a good case to show you that libertarians are pragmatic in their approach, that we do represent all of you. And I'd just like to encourage you, 2014, just be libertarian with us just once. If you don't like it, you can go back to the same two in 2016.
Kris Pierce.
What? After that comment, if we were all Democrats, there would be no gun violence. No, I'm just kidding. Boy, did I get no no's on that one. I am the chair of the Democratic Party, but I in no way represent many of the members that have the D behind their name, and I'm just speaking on my own behalf. So I don't think many people thought when they saw that the chair of the Democratic Party would be sitting here that I'd be advocating for there should not be an assault weapons ban. So I would hope that people, that's why I wanted to be part of this, is to say, and not all Republicans are, I want all my guns, I got to have them, no compromise, no nothing, because that's not true either. I think this has been a great experience, and I want to extend it to, I have a new television show, and my new friend, Andy Allen of the Nebraska Firearms Owners Association, will be on that, and we're talking gun control, so I would encourage you guys to find out about that show. But I'd like the fact that I can show to you that not all Ds are liberal, because I'm not, and not all Ds are about taking away your guns. Compromise with me. I'll give you guns if you give me the magazines.
All right, Kris, thank you. Bryan.
I am very excited that you want compromise, but I'm a little surprised, Kris. A little surprised that you're still pushing for limits on magazine size, because you've acknowledged that these laws won't keep them out of the hands of criminals anyways. It's just going to affect it's going to affect the opportunity for law-abiding citizens to protect their families. I just want to close by saying this whole gun control issue is obviously wrought with emotion, and that's why when we address it, we have to be careful about how we address it. We have to be careful about our solutions. We have to make sure they're effective. We have to, rather than just offering us a false sense of security, We have to be careful that the solutions we offer respect the fundamental civil right to defend ourselves and our families. We have to be careful that our well-intentioned solutions don't lead to unintended negative consequences like victim disarmament, emboldening of criminal activity, indirect racism, creating a lucrative market to fund illegal activity, and actually increasing the rates of violent crime. So I think when we address these issues, we always need to keep in mind the precepts of individual liberty and freedom.
All right, Tim, your turn.
As often happens when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, it opens up a can of worms and creates more questions than they resolve. The Heller case resolved the question of whether or not there's an individual right associated with gun ownership. That's set in law. But the Supreme Court said that that's subject to reasonable regulation. And that's now the frontier that we find ourselves on. What is that reasonable regulation? And that's going to be fought out through the political process, through compromise in legislation, through challenges in court. And this question is far from over. It's not going to be resolved, certainly in my lifetime, and probably not in the lifetime of the youngest person in this room. We're on a long, long road of discussion. And as long as we can continue to have forums like this, opportunities to exchange ideas, opportunities to engage in dialogue and see where compromise is possible, we're going to make progress.
All right,
but
Tim,
if we dig in our heels, we'll get no progress.
And Laura.
Well, I find this very exciting. For the first time in a long time, we're actually sitting around talking about civil liberties, and, we all agree that civil liberties are important, and I think that's a good thing out of all of this. We're not talking just about gun rights and the Second Amendment, but we also talked about the inalienability of our First Amendment rights and on and on. So I think that's a good thing. I stopped by Shields the other day, and I stopped by Cabela's on the way in, and I noticed that their both gun and ammunition supply is dwindling. Somebody asked me the other day why that's happening, and I said, well, it's more difficult to limit our First Amendment rights when 78% of the population has easy access to the Internet. It's more difficult to limit our freedom of religion when there are churches, synagogues, and mosques in every direction, and it's more difficult to limit our gun rights when more people have them.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for coming out to this forum tonight. If you would, just give all of our panelists a big round of applause for a spectacular job. I'll have to say this, as many people who probably know me, and I see a lot of familiar faces out here, this was not easy for me to bite my tongue. I want you to know there was a lot of times tonight that was, but it was a great dialogue. It was a healthy dialogue, an important dialogue for us and for our country. So thank you very much for coming. Drive safe.